Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 247, Painting with Judaism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And before we jump into our look-back discussion on this series on women and feminism and Judaism, we wanted to start, as we often do in these look-back episodes, by just thanking you so much for your support of Judaism Unbound over all these years. We're getting close to our 5-year mark. Not quite there yet. That's going to happen in March. But in the meantime, we are just so grateful for all the emails that we get from listeners and all the suggestions that we get. I want to note that there's another way that you can help us, actually two other ways. One is that you can go on the Apple Podcast app or iTunes or anywhere else. Actually, I should mention that we are now on audible.com. So if you listen to audiobooks all the time like me, you can also find Judaism Unbound there. But in any event, if you could go to wherever you listen to podcasts and write a review of Judaism Unbound, or at least give us a 5-star rating, that actually helps people find the podcast. And one of the things that we were talking about recently with somebody was how many listeners we have, and they asked, how did you get so many listeners? And we said, what kind of advertising do you do? And we said, well, we do a little bit of a boosted Facebook post every week, but they were pretty amazed that that was enough to get as many listeners as we have. And that's all thanks to the word of mouth and all the recommendations that you do on these apps. So that would be a really helpful thing that you could do for us in honor of maybe a Hanukkah present coming up. And the other Hanukkah present that you could start to consider at this time of year is to make a small donation to Judaism Unbound. If you now go to our website at www.judaismunbound.com/donate, you can actually click on the donate button and it'll give you an option to either make an annual gift, basically meaning a one-time gift, or a monthly gift. In other words, you can sign up to give something like $5 a month to Judaism Unbound, or if you're feeling really generous, $10 a month, or if you really just can't afford that much, just $1 a month. But whatever you sign up for, it'll automatically charge your credit card once a month. And that is a really great way for us to have a reliable sense of what we're going to have coming in each month. And it's really a terrific way to give. And a lot of people like to give that way these days. So you can now do that really easily for Judaism Unbound. And again, the way to do that is to go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate. So one more program note before we get started. We are recording this episode the day before Election Day, so we don't know what happened in the election as we're recording this. In fact, it hasn't really happened yet. And so when you're listening to it, though, you will know, or you might know, or you'll know a lot more information than we know right now. So we're not talking about the election this week. We'll see what happens after that. But for now, we are just wishing you all strength, comfort, and to have a nice weekend as much as you can and relax this weekend, and just listen to an episode that was recorded in the blissful ignorance of what happened in the election.
Yeah, I'll just really echo the excitement you mentioned about reviews in different podcast apps. It feels really great to read those reviews. And honestly, even if it's not, a perfect review, if you have thoughts that you want to voice in those reviews, give the 5 stars. We love that. But if you want to say something about what you'd like to see in the future, we really do read those, and it goes a long way. So definitely reviews, if you're not able to donate financially, are just as appreciated. So thank you.
Really thinking a lot about the episodes that we've done recently, it really goes back to something that we've talked about time and again on this podcast, which is this distinction between what you could call inclusion, meaning that Judaism is what it is, and as we kind of evolve in our thinking about various things that are important, we realize, this community of people, this kind of people were insufficiently welcomed into our community before, and so we should become more welcoming. And so let's now give women more rights. Let's now bring in LGBTQ folks to have a more invited place in our community. Let's pay more attention to Jews of color, et cetera, et cetera. That's a kind of inclusion approach that imagines that what's going to happen is that these people are going to come in and just find their place in Judaism as it's always been, and that'll be the end of it, and we can pat ourselves on the back for being more inclusive. As opposed to another approach which says, It seems likely that if a certain class, a certain kind of people have not been involved in Judaism in an active way, or in Jewish institutions, I should say, in the institutions that we think of as comprising the Jewish community, if they haven't really been open to a certain category of people, there's a very strong chance that what is happening in those institutions will never really be of interest to that category of people or to many members of that category of people. And so often I think that impulse to be inclusive turns out to, at its best, become an invitation to folks to create something profoundly new that speaks to their understanding of what Judaism is or could be for them. And I think what's really interesting when we talk about the category of women, I'm excited about some of the things that we've seen over the last few weeks, precisely because they are different from the notion that women would be entering into the set of institutions that were already there in the Jewish community and just taking a spot in leadership or in participation. But in fact, we see these organizations being created that in many ways are sort of profoundly rethinking Judaism. Like Kohenet is profoundly saying, what would it look like to have a Jewish community led by and centered on the experience of women? And you see that they even have a new category of the title of the leader. So instead of being led by a rabbi, it's led by a priestess. In the case of Torah, the regendered Torah, you see somebody saying, hey, it may be that the Torah itself doesn't work once we say that this is a space that women should feel absolutely that they own. And so here we have to, and so I was particularly wowed by the comment that Yael Kanarek made that simply the act of regendering the Torah allows her to read it in a way that reading the Torah before always felt in some way like reading somebody else's work, somebody being invited maybe into somebody else's home. And as welcoming as somebody may be when they invite you to their home, there's a real difference between that and, buying your first house and welcoming others into your home.
Yeah, for me, I'm flashing to the beginning of our unit, or at least close to the beginning of our unit, and also some of our recent episodes. I want to try to bring some stuff together because I'm thinking of two key moments on this front that you bring up of inclusion on the one hand, we've got our thing, we've got Judaism, and we're going to open it up to other people, we're going to include people, versus the idea that actually folks that are not centered in that Judaism will be the ones to set the tone, and we who have been included in the past will follow them. Two different impulses. So I'm flashing back to with Judith Rosenbaum, the episode we did about the Jewish Women's Archive. She spoke about, I loved this part. She was like, some of the most popular pages on our website are the pages for biblical women, are the pages for Deborah, for Miriam. Jewish Women's Archive has all sorts of pages on their website for various Jewish women from the recent past in American Jewish history, from the more expansive, broader past, going back to history beyond just America. And they have biblical women like Deborah, like Miriam. And those are the ones that get the most traction. And she was expressing kind of frustration at that. And I think part of why those pages get so many clicks is precisely because we're trying to play this inclusion game, right? We're trying to mine the depths of Judaism as we have inherited it, as we have seen it, and say, oh, we're gonna scrape and claw to find the women's voices that we can. And look, there are women's voices in the Bible. They're not that many, and sometimes they're not all that flattering, but we can find Deborah, this judge, in the book of Judges. We can find Miriam in Exodus and throughout the rest of the 5 books of Moses. So that's a great place to go if you're looking at the existing tradition and saying, we have to play on this field. We want to find women's voices that are on that field. If you want to play a different game, you could go to the entire rest of the Jewish Women's Archive website and say, oh my gosh, there's hundreds upon hundreds of Jewish women who their stories are important and they made important contributions, whether it's to Jewish society or to the broader world, but we've never really called them Judaism. I'm thinking about Emma Lazarus because me and a bunch of friends just spoke about Emma Lazarus, the poet who wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty. I think people think of her as, a notable woman in history, in American history. Some of them might even know she's Jewish and think of her as a notable Jewish woman in history. I don't know how many people think of her as part of like Judaism. Think of The New Colossus, the poem about welcoming immigrants into America, which we could find all sorts of Jewish resonances. But like, I don't think people think about it as like a document of Judaism alongside the Torah and the Talmud and everything else. And that's what brings me to the other side of this, which is Yael Kanarek and Torah, her Torah, which very much is taking, on one hand, you could argue it actually is a little bit of an inclusion maneuver, right? Because it's taking the most centralized text of Judaism that we've had, which is the Torah and eventually the Bible, and it's flipping the genders. But I do think there's a way in which that's more radical than just accepting tradition as it's been, because it really is flipping everything around. I mean, I think traditionalists would feel that you are in fact changing the very text of this sacred book, and in doing so, changing its meaning. And I think they're right. And that's why I want to do it.
Hearing you talk about that and also listening to our guests, it really makes me confront, in my case, as a cisgendered white man, there's a level at which you really don't fully understand as much as you try, as much as you want to try. I think that there's a level at which I just can't understand in the sense of feeling it in my body, right? I mean, I understand it intellectually, but in terms of feeling it in my body, what is it like to read literature and to find it kind of impenetrable because you don't see people like me there? Because there are always people like me there. And it really struck me when Yael was talking about how simply the act of regendering the Torah and just making it so that when you read the same exact stories in your own gender, that makes it accessible in a new way. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that that's the solution. I worry that there is no solution, meaning that actually, I shouldn't say that I worry that there's no solution. I actually like the idea that there's no solution because I've been advocating all along for something that tracks the approach of disruptive innovation, right? Which really says that when there's some kind of dominant entity in a marketplace, whether it's an organization, a concept, or whatever, that one way to address it is to try to change it. But often it can't really be changed enough because the current participants in it don't want to let it change that much. So as somebody who says the only way that I can participate in this thing is if it's very different from the way it is now, there may not be any road to make it that different through the existing network of institutions and concepts that are there, because there's an equal and opposite or a stronger and opposite force trying to pull it in the other direction. But there's another option that's available, which is to say, hey, we can rebuild this. And the way that I'm still trying to find just the right metaphor, but to my mind, it's kind of like looking at something that was once a machine and all the parts kind of fit together and whirred along together, and to say, well, let's look at that instead of as a machine, let's look at that as a pile of parts, like it just fell apart and now it's a pile of parts. Now we can go to that pile and say, which pieces do we want to rescue and bring over to another place and build a new machine out of it? What would a Judaism 3.0 or 4.0 look like that was built from scratch by all the people who had previously been kept out of the central roles in the old Judaism, and some of the people that were in central roles in the old Judaism? In other words, I don't think that there shouldn't be any men involved in that rebuilding. It's what would it look like if it was a team effort of all the people who we now believe should be central in the building of something called Judaism, or the next version of Judaism, and they were able to use as many parts from the old Judaism as they wanted, and they were also able to use any other parts that they wanted. If it's true, and I think it is, that when you do something like regendering the Torah and potentially all the other works of Jewish literature, that would be what gives an entree to many women to feel like, oh, I can finally feel like this is me, that I can at least hear myself here, even though I know that these are old stories about men that were just regendered. If that's the answer, then realistically, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to do that to the whole Jewish tradition, and certainly not in a way that says, like, we're going to now replace the old stuff with this new stuff. Not that Yael says that that's the goal. Whereas I think you could say, hey, let's all get together and create something new over here that includes, that includes all these other materials. So it actually gives me a sense of excitement that, maybe if we start to think about women being 51% or more of the population, that we can say, hey, it's not only the small minority groups that have been kept out before, but actually a huge group that has been kept out before. And if all of those groups can now team up and say, hey, let's actually create something new together, that maybe there's some hope for doing that.
There's a lot here about how this links into our questions of the future of Judaism and what it would look like to sort of seed, SEED, that future. I also, this is like a little thing. I know you didn't mean much with this. I've been generally pushing myself not to use the language of women being 50% or even 51% of the population, just out of love for non-binary folks and sort of breaking down the binary, because as there are more and more folks who identify as non-binary, that kind of number gets a little pushed. But I went just as a thing to think about for all of us.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And we got to find some new language to talk about that. But my major point was a huge percentage of the population as opposed to a relatively small percentage.
Yeah. But what I'm thinking about also is I want to talk about newness, stuff being new, because we on this show and also all of our guests, when we talk about incredible new creations like Torah, like this regendered Torah, when we talk about Kohenet, when we talk about a lot of cool organizations, we instrumentalize the fact that they are new we treat that as like, oh, sure, they're new, but they can serve to achieve X, Y, or Z amazing goals. And I really believe that. I do think that part of the magic of regendering the Torah is what it could lead to down the line in recreating Judaism, reinventing Judaism, all the things that you're talking about. I also feel compelled to say, it's fun to have a new sacred document with new language. It is exciting. It is interesting. And I'm going to be blunt. Look, it's boring sometimes to do the same stories every year. It's really uncool to say that. And I'm saying it bluntly specifically because I think it sounds a little harsher than I mean it. And look, I do read these stories every year. I find new meaning in them. I'm not discarding any of that. But I'm 29, I'm about to be 30. And I've been deeply embedded in the Torah cycle, not for all of those years, but for let's say 10 of those years. And I know my takes on a lot of these Torah portions. And do they change as I change? Sure. Are there certain directions that they just aren't going to go and that I feel like I've exhausted myself as a rabbinical student and soon a rabbi? Yes. Part of the fun, and I'm using fun on purpose, it's not just that it's sacred and beautiful, which it is. It is a powerful thing and it gives voice to those who have been voiceless. But part of the fun of having a new text is, oh my gosh, I don't have a relationship to Abraham, the regendered version of Abraham. I have no idea what my approach is as a reader to that story of Abraham and Yitzchak, the father binding the ladder on Mount Moriah. I don't have a relationship to that. Yes, it's close in certain ways to my relationship with the Abraham and Isaac binding of Isaac's story, but it's new. And honestly, I feel like we got to be able to say, sometimes it's just great to have new stuff. And we have so much of this refrain in Jewish life that kind of what makes this whole thing magical is the fact that it's old and the fact that, everybody on the planet is reading the same Torah portion the same week because we've passed it down. Or I went to that Saturday afternoon service that Yael Kanarek leads where they read the women's Torah, and I actually had the privilege of chanting from that Torah. It was so refreshing and fun just because it was different. And this flashes me back to something we talked about, I don't know, way back when, which is what I try to term familiarity versus variety. And I think so much of Jewish life is built on this idea that people want to feel rhythm and they want to feel like there's a consistency in their life, that everything else is whirling around in craziness. And so religion or Judaism is that thing that provides a pattern and it provides consistency. And I'll be honest with you, if that's what Judaism were to me, I would not be doing it. I would be totally uninterested in it, and I would not be a rabbinical student. Like, the only reason I'm interested in this is the fact that I feel I have agency to mess with it and to have it be new. Because you could have the greatest service tailor-made for Lex on the planet, and I would want to go to it once or twice. And then I'd want to do a different thing. And so I'm thinking about that with gender because I want to lift that up in addition to all of the really sacred reasons that this is important, specifically because women are being celebrated, not just because it's new and different. But I also do want to say, like, it shouldn't be, wow, this is so great, even though it's new. It should be, wow, this is so fantastic. And wow, it's a new rewritten Torah. That's amazing. We don't have to apologize for that.
I've been playing with this analogy of painting and Judaism. That, in other words, I'm trying to put Judaism into the right category because there are some people that, and I respect them, that really do want Judaism that is kind of, it's known, it's the same every time, right? That meaning it's comforting. It's, if that's what religion is, like you were saying. I mean, for some people, that's fine. I'm not suggesting that they should change. And I'm looking for an analogy that kind of supports that. So I'm saying, like, for me, painting is an action where you take paint and you make something out of it. You take the paint and you put it on a surface, and there are all kinds of things that you can do with the paint on that surface. Sometimes it's like painting a wall in your house, like you paint it all one color, and it's a neutral color, and you're happy to see the same color every day. And that's fine. And then there's painting that artists have done for many years. And here I mean painting like pictures, like painting, it's like paintings, and there's all kinds of painting that came out of the Western world for so many centuries. And it's mostly white people, and it's mostly men doing heroic things and women in sometimes doing heroic things, but most often in some way serving men or being used by men and all kinds of things like that. And if you say, like, that's what painting is, then if I were a woman or if I were a person of color, I would look at all those paintings, and I imagine this is the experience of a lot of people going to museums and saying, I don't like these paintings because I don't see anyone like me there. Or if I do see somebody like me, they're always doing something that makes me feel kind of icky. But one could say there are people who go into those museums and see the genius work of the painter and really just appreciate the technique. Okay, fine. But when we think about painting, we don't imagine that if somebody takes the paint and goes off and paints a different kind of picture, right? A picture where the women or the people of color may be doing something heroic or great, or where they actually just do something abstract and modern, or like you're saying, they have fun with it. You kind of say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. From our perspective today, I think most of us accept that there are a lot of different things that you can do with paint. And what I'm suggesting is that if we understood Judaism to be the paint and not the painting, not the specific way that the paint has been used throughout history, then that's a very empowering possibility. That if we understand Judaism to be the material of art and not the art itself, then I think that gives us a lot more freedom. And when people say, what's Jewish about that, right? When they're talking about a particular new experiment, or when you say, hey, we're going to regender the entire Torah, well, that's a violation somehow because the Torah is meant to be the way that it was. Well, think about it a different way. Think about the Torah as being the paint. And that the question is, what are you going to paint with it? And if you paint a mirror image Torah where where everything is regendered, that's actually just as traditional as the Torah as we've received it, because it's using the same material just in a different way. I mean, that's the image that I'm trying to kind of get into the conversation here.
I want to push that even farther because so you've brought this up before and I love it, and it's informed my own thinking in some very deep ways. And I want to be really crystal clear about what the paint is. because you just said something powerful, which is the Torah is the paint. It's not that the Torah is the painting. The Torah is the paint, and we can then paint with it in whatever ways we do. That's great. I want much beyond, and I think you agree with this, I want much beyond the Torah to be the paint. And I think sometimes we're not quite explicit enough with that on this show. Like, because when folks hear Judaism, part of the whole reason behind our name, Judaism Unbound, right, is we want to push what that word means. But I think when people hear Judaism is the paint, it's like, we can take Torah stories and midrashes, fan fiction on the Torah stories. We can take Talmud. We can take all these texts of Jewish tradition and we can channel those in new ways. We can do our own takes, which is one level of this. I want the paint to also be Emma Lazarus's poetry. I want the paint to also be the Book of Jubilees or Enoch that didn't make it into the accepted canon. This is actually bringing me to an episode recently that wasn't technically part of this series on women, but the New Jewish Canon, where we talked about questions of canon. Like, I think this is very relevant here because the paint absolutely needs to be Torah. Like, we need to accept your presumption that we're not dealing with paintings that we have to go over to and polish and preserve in our museum of Judaism. That's not what we're doing. Like, I'm finding myself drawn to when Andrew Raymer was on the show, and he's a storyteller. He's a brilliant storyteller. And he spoke about how there was a time where his mom and him needed to hammer something up on the wall in like a new home they were moving into. I forget exactly the specifics, but they couldn't find any hammer. They didn't have any hammer. So they grabbed a shoe and they used the shoe as a hammer. And like, from my perspective, we have abundant shoes of Jewish tradition. We're not, the shoes for the purposes of this metaphor are inheritances that we have Jewishly, Jewish history, Jewishness, Jewish culture, all of these things in quotes. Like, they're things that are right there for us as Jews that we know and see are part of Jewish history, but somehow we think they're just shoes lying around. We don't think they are implements to be used for Judaism. We think they are sideline things that, like, sure, they're in our house. They're like alongside the nice paintings and the important tools like hammers. But when you say to yourself, we can use the shoe as a hammer. We can use these pieces of Jewish history that were excised or marginalized. All of a sudden, that project is both exciting, and it turns out that when you do that, you often amplify voices, specifically of folks like women, folks like LGBTQ folks like Jews of color, because those are the people that have been treated like shoes and not like actual tools for the creation of Judaism. I'm thinking about right now, it's the month of Cheshvan on the Jewish calendar, and I have a real pet peeve with how people talk about this month, because so frequently I hear folks say, Cheshvan is this month after Tishrei. So Tishrei is when Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, all of those holidays are a bunch of holidays. And Cheshvan is this release where there's no Jewish holidays. That's what people say. Wrong. There is a major Jewish holiday in the month of Cheshvan. It's called Sigd. It is an Ethiopian Jewish holiday celebrated by the Beta Israel, which is a group of Jews in Africa that traces a long, long way back. It's a major moment on the calendar that marks 7 weeks after Yom Kippur. It parallels the time period from Passover to Shavuot, which is also 7 weeks. Big deal. And if that group was the hegemonic group that determined what Judaism was and what the paint is, then we would not be saying there's no holidays in the month of Cheshvan. What it reflects that we say there's no holidays in the month of Cheshvan is that white Jews have written what Judaism is and what the paint is. And so, sure, people might know that Sigd exists. Most don't. But let's say even the people who know Sigd exists, they're like, sure, that's like a Jewish holiday, but is it Judaism? Is it Rabbinic Judaism? Is it American Judaism? Like, I don't know, but I'm less concerned with that question, because from my perspective, the whole mission should be finding those pieces that weren't marked as Judaism, that weren't seen as the paint, and centering precisely those as we vision the Jewish future, because that's where the excitement's going to be, that's where the energy is going to be, and that's where new meaning's going to be.
I would note also that there's another holiday in Cheshvan, which is that in the ancient biblical times in the Northern Kingdom, there was a holiday that paralleled Sukkot in Tishrei, so it was in the 15th of Cheshvan was the holiday in the Northern Kingdom. And
Whoa.
so it's not even that we don't have ancient roots for a Jewish holiday in Cheshvan.
Mic drop. Love it.
And by the way, a lot of people say, oh, the Northern Kingdom, that's the bad guys, in the story. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's because the story was written by the people in the Southern Kingdom, but the truth is that you're right then. And also in archaeology, we've learned that the 10 lost tribes aren't really lost, that they actually, many of them migrated south into the Southern Kingdom and became refugees and kind of merged into the Southern Kingdom of Judah. But many of us might trace our lineage actually to the 10 lost tribes, in other words, to the Northern Kingdom, right? And so in some ways that might actually be our holiday. By the way, I will say about women also that lest you think that it's such an innovation or such a dangerous thing to regender the Torah, that we should ask ourselves, perhaps the Torah as we've received it is somewhat regendered, meaning that I think it's very likely, in fact, this is said about Deborah, for example, you mentioned her earlier, that she was an important judge, that it may be, and it seems quite likely, that Deborah was one of the most ancient characters in the Bible, and that it very well may be that in the earliest days of Israel, the earliest days of the people of Israel, meaning that they were led by women or by at least a woman. And there is a vestige of that reality still in the book of Judges, but largely it's been kind of written out or minimized in the Bible as we have it, meaning that the Bible as we have it was erasing the role of a prominent woman.
Same with Miriam's song, because that was made into Moses' song.
Right, and so there is a possibility that one could go back and try to kind of rewrite some of those stories of Deborah and of Miriam to try to reemphasize their stories, and some people have done those things in novels and elsewhere. But who are the women that we don't even know because they've been completely erased from the text? Meaning the point is that the text that we've received, and I'm not just talking about the Torah text here, I'm talking about essentially the text of Judaism, is already one that has been significantly regendered in favor of men. So then the question is, what do you do to kind of make a tikkun or a repair of that? And one possibility is to try to rescue those stories, but you can't always find them. So another possibility is like, okay, let's take the men's stories and regender them to be women, right? There are all kinds of other possibilities. And I'm not necessarily saying that either of those possibilities is the best or the right or the only approach. I think that this analogy of the paint, the Torah was made out of the paint. The Judaism that we've received, what we have to do is we have to first kind of abstract from it and say, what is this made out of? What are the paints that this was painted out of? And then once we can say, oh, these are the Jewish paints, then we can say, okay, and like, let's take those paints as well as the new Jewish paints, like you were talking about, that have been created since then, Emma Lazarus and, whatever those things might be. And, of course, the paints that were not Jewish in the sense that they were seen as Jewish from time immemorial, but rather new things that we're bringing in, whether we see those as like a different color of paint, or perhaps we start to see those as mixed media art that we, might see, where we also use stones and paints and all kinds of things to create more modern art as we see in museums today. And there's this question that I think gets a lot of people hung up, is this question of, but is this traditional? Is this Jewish? What makes it Jewish? Doesn't it have to have these components? I think that there's some degree to which components do need to be retained in order to have the sense of continuity from one to the other. But which components those are, nobody can say. And in fact, that the answer to that is often discovered on the other end by whether it works, whether people feel connected to it, whether people stay with it. And that's the question for me is kind of how can we empower people to really do that and to say, my task as a Jewish leader, so to speak, is not to step into an existing Jewish institution or an existing Jewish way of doing things and take a role that had previously been denied to me. That's totally fine. That's totally wonderful. I'm not saying one shouldn't do that. I'm saying there's another option, which is to say I'm going to become an artist or even an avant-garde artist, right? And I'm going to take this material and I'm going to reshape it in an exciting way. At the end of the day, I think the solution, so to speak, the Judaism that's really going to catch on is probably somewhere between those two extremes, right? It's probably neither going to be the avant-garde that turns into something that becomes its own system, or the old system migrating. It's likely that that somebody ends up finding a place in between that says, I can take the most exciting things from the avant-garde and the most stable things from the old system and mix them together and create something cool. But if we don't have an avant-garde, then that person never has the opportunity to select that stuff.
Yeah, to keep belaboring the metaphor, you use the word solution. A literal solution is when you mix a liquid with water. So if you have the paint, which is our term for like the avant-garde Judaism, and then you mix it with that stable piece, which I think water would be as good a stable piece as any. Water has for thousands of years been a symbolic player in the meaning makings of Judaism and will continue to be, I'm sure. We could talk about seas of reeds. We could talk about Torah as water, all of that. But so paint and water, maybe that's our solution in the literal chemical sense.
Nice.
Thank you. I'm realizing we haven't talked about Yishai Husidman today, and we're spending our episode talking about paint, and we had this previous guest on Judaism Unbound who's a literal painter, and whose whole thing, I mean, I don't want to, it's not a shtick, it's not a joke, but he did this beautiful exhibition, and it toured around multiple exhibitions, where he took the chemical compound from the gas chambers of the Holocaust and found like, I'm going to get this wrong, but basically found like what the residue was, what like the color was that it created. And it's a very specific Prussian blue is the name of the pigment that's associated with that. And he did all of these beautiful paintings using that precise chemical compound. And it was this powerful reclaiming of this pigment that was used for catastrophic genocide of the Jewish people being remobilized towards a new kind of Jewish art. And by the way, the art he made, it's not as if it was pictures of Torahs and Jewish stars and menorahs. Like it was, you could look at these without knowing they were Jewish, and maybe you would have no idea that this is an artist connecting them to the Holocaust, to Jewish tradition, etc. But from my perspective, exactly. Like we should be taking the various paints, the various pieces of our tradition, including those painful ones. That's like, it's important to think about like, okay, it's not that we have literal gas chambers of the Torah and of the Talmud that we can mobilize in this way, but we have really terrible pieces of story, of narrative that have been mobilized to hurt massive groups of people, to hurt individuals. And I think part of what gets people nervous when we talk about like the Judaism is paint and we can just pick and choose is like people think we're going to just excise all the crappy parts and keep the stuff we like. And that's sort of an easy way out. And like, no, I actually specifically want to look to the pieces of Torah, of Jewish tradition that are most painful and mobilize those as paint too. I just don't want to use them in the specific context that they've been used, that has been mobilized towards harming lots of people. So I think that Yishai Husidman methodology, which he's doing literally, he go listen to that episode 157. He literally took this pigment and created new art out of it. I think that we as Jews would benefit from that. But the prerequisite is absolutely what you said, and which I'm echoing, which is we have to see ourselves as artists, avant-gardists we have to see ourselves as agents in this process. And it requires a certain approach to things like Kohenet, things like her Torah, Torah, all of these, where the fact of their newness, the fact that they're like new methodologies of painting to keep this going, doesn't make them less authentic or real. It actually makes them precisely the point.
Right. And then it puts me in the mind of a question of, like, as I think about these organizations, including the Jewish Women's Archive, but also I'm thinking about At the Well and Kohenet. And then I'm also thinking about the organizations that we talked to in our Jews of Color series, like Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy, and others. And then I'm thinking about the LGBT series that we've done, like Svara being one of the most prominent of the spaces that's really an LGBTQ-focused Talmud study space. Now, some of these might invite people that don't fit into their main category of the people that they serve more often than others. But in some ways, I think part of the power of what these organizations are doing and why it's so exciting is because there isn't a lot of pull in the opposite direction, because they are not trying to create a space that is for everybody. And so they're saying, let's create a space that's really largely by and for us. Now, the question that I think arises is, as that happens, you can imagine that things will go off in different directions that may get further and further from each other. I'm thinking a little bit about how the Big Bang and who was it that, I think it was Hubble, that saw that there's a redshift and all the galaxies are going away from each other. The question is, as we start to see Jewish spaces created for different subsets of Jews, and they don't have a gravitational pull where somebody's saying to them, hey, you should really not do that because, then it's really pulling the community apart, then they will kind of redshift, and get further apart. The question is, what is a way to kind of keep them talking to each other? Or do you think that this is not important or necessary? A way to keep them talking to each other, talking to other longer-term existing organizations, et cetera, to try to create some sense that we're still part of the same task of trying to find a Judaism that works for the future. How do you think about that?
I think the organizations that are long-standing and interested in this project of recreating Judaism find a way to make that apparent. I'm thinking of the National Council of Jewish Women in this unit. Like, there's no question to me that they like the project that we're talking about. The National Council of Jewish Women, for those who didn't listen to that episode, is over 130 years old. I mean, it's a long-standing legacy organization, and a lot of that episode was talking specifically about how they're really jazzed to partner with new projects. I don't perceive a problem where those kinds of projects and newer projects are really hitting up against walls. I think the problem is that there are other kinds of long-standing projects, often synagogues, often other legacy organizations, that really aren't jazzed, really extra excited by the growth of these newer forms of Judaism. It's not that they hate them, but I think there are a lot of places for whom the idea of new projects like this that aren't the ones that have been centered in each community historically is seen as a threat. It's seen as our institution's future is at stake. And so they might sort of, in the abstract, like the fact that Judaism is vibrant and creating these new possibilities. Practically, they don't love that and they want to have members. And so I think there's this tension there. I think that those organizations are in trouble moving forward because I think that they're right on some level that there's a threat. And if they continue to see it through that lens and fight against it, it's not going to work. I'm thinking of when I grew up, my family watched a lot of TV. It was like a weekly calendar of my life, which shows that we watched were on NBC and CBS and Fox and which night of the week they were on. Like must-see TV Thursday on NBC. I remember watching The Office, watching all sorts of shows that were on but like those networks were like the thing. And you probably anticipate where I'm going with this. At a certain point, Netflix emerges. It's at first, sending out movies in the mail, but then it starts to do this streaming service. And I think those networks correctly perceived a threat there, that there are these streaming services that people could access at any given moment of their lives. They could watch multiple episodes in a row. They don't have to wait till next week. And those networks thought to themselves, we might be in trouble. And I remember I'm a nerd enough about TV to actually watch the Emmys. I grew up watching the Emmys. I still do. And every year, all the shows that were nominated for all the main awards forever were on NBC, CBS, Fox, ABC. Always. You had to be on those. And it was a huge deal when a show on FX won the best drama in, early 2000s. And now I watch these shows and the vast majority of them are from Netflix, from Amazon Prime, from Hulu, etc. Or maybe they're from networks, but they're not from CBS or Fox or ABC. They're from HBO, those kinds of things. And from my perspective, that makes sense because these were new projects that had fewer rules in play, that were able to test out a whole bunch of shows at once, see what worked, see what didn't. They didn't have to worry about time slots in the same way. You're not on TV, so you don't have the same exactly 30 minutes with 7.5 minutes of commercials. And then they flipped the entire game. And now the networks do a lot of work of trying to copy what the other folks are doing. I want Jewish institutions to get to that point. I want them to say, okay, we have been led already by these outsider projects like Kohenet, like others. We need to take some notes. We're not actually leading. We're not actually the center right now. I don't think they're ready to say that yet. I think they still really feel that they are the first stop for people. And until they realize that that's not the case for an emerging generation of Jews that like are very engaged, that are watching all of Netflix to proverbially carry this forward, there's going to continue to be this tension. And I'm with you. I'd like it to be one unified project.
One thing that I had in my mind was that, there's a question of how do they relate to the existing institutions, but there's also a question of how do they relate to each other. And I think it's interesting to think about like the overlapping membership in some of these organizations. Like, for example, there are people that are Jews of color that are also LGBTQ, and they might study at both Svara and Amud. And then there are people that are, women, and they may be inspired to be a priestess or to be involved with the priestesses, and they're also LGBTQ, and so they study at Svara and they do these things. So instead of the connections all being back to the center, imagine the connections moving to be across among each other. The other thing is that, and I think that this connects to the next series of episodes that we'll be doing as a series. We're also going to be doing a few more standalone episodes, but the next big series that we're doing is on philanthropy. And it's interesting to think about philanthropy through this lens in a certain kind of way, because we think of philanthropy as fundamentally about, generosity, about giving and supporting. But what if we think about philanthropy in a different way? Think about philanthropy as like the Netflix, because in a way, Netflix doesn't really produce. I don't think Netflix is a studio. Like Netflix doesn't produce these shows itself. What Netflix does is it gives money to these studios to produce their show. So do the networks, by the way, often. But what the difference between Netflix and NBC is that for various reasons, like some of which you said and also others, Netflix is able to cast a wider net. And so Netflix is able to take a lot of chances that the studios can't take or won't take, partly because the studios are locked into this hour-by-hour schedule system, and so they're a lot more risk-averse. If we think about the difference between one kind of philanthropist, right, that's more like the NBC kind of philanthropist that says we want to be really careful with what we're doing, we really have a way that we're trying to preserve things, they're going to be a lot less adventurous in their philanthropy. Versus who would be the philanthropist who's more like Netflix that says, I'm going to try a lot of stuff. Some of it's going to just completely fail. But some of them are going to be the big hit show that starts to win all the Emmys and everything.
I just looked up the root of the word philanthropy. I realized it never occurred to me to think like, what does it mean in the original form? Philanthropy, I kid you not, means love of humans, like human loving.
Yeah, philos and anthropos.
Like anthropology is humans, and phil is like love. Right. And so it's like a fascinating move, and I'm kind of I don't know. I don't love this actually. Like it's like an interesting move that word was applied so fully, so completely to the act of giving of one's money. Because I think there's other ways that people should and could and do show love of humankind. But like here we are. So we didn't plan that out. We didn't know we were going to do like, hey, everyone, come and listen to our next unit. But that's what we ended up doing today. And we're not doing it shamelessly. Like we do think there's a real tie between some of the units we've been doing, looking at the voices of women, looking at the voices of Jews of color, looking at the voices of LGBTQ Jews. We really see that as tying into these broad conversations we're going to be having, looking at our Jewish philanthropic world and bluntly how it could change. Thank you all so much for listening. We've really enjoyed traveling through this unit of episodes with you. We really, sincerely, completely, fully, deeply love when you are in touch with us, especially when you've just listened to a bunch of our episodes, you've got a fresh take of your own, you've got a question, you've got a thought, whatever it is, please shoot us a note. There's a bunch of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our other social media accounts, Instagram and Twitter. All of them are Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And then last but not least, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. Like Dan said at the top, we really do appreciate whatever acts of, ready for it, philanthropy you can send our way. We mean that in the expansive human-loving sense. We mean it both as if you're able to give us money, which you can do at JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring donation basis or just as a one-time gift. Or you can do via a review in a podcast app, which we also experience as being loved as humans. So go to Apple Podcasts, go to Google Podcasts, go to Overcast, whatever you use, and give us a review. All of that is deeply appreciated, and we just express huge gratitude to you for wandering with us, whether this is your first episode, your 247th episode, or whatever in between. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.